Charlie, are we ready?
I think so,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know you all are incredibly busy people and we appreciate the time you're giving to us today. My name is Lavasani and I'm CEO of Psychedelic Medicine Coalition. Prior to that, I was chairwoman of Decriminalize Nature DC, where we passed Initiative 81, which decriminalized psychedelics for the city of Washington, DC. Today we're going to talk about psychedelic research. We think that supporting psychedelic research is a good first step for our lawmakers to take. This research is happening, and there's no federal funding. Well, there's very little federal funding available to research institutions, and we believe that a dedicated stream of funding is necessary to look at issues of safety and efficacy. So today, that's going to be the subject of our discussion, and I have some really great panelists here. To my right, I have Dr. Allsop. He is a scientist, psychiatrist, and musician from Yale University. He is an MD from Harvard Medical School, PhD in neuroscience from MIT, and is an Emerson Scholar from Berklee College of Music. He's currently chief resident on the Clinical Neuroscience Research Unit in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale, and conducts research at the intersection of social cognition, psychedelics, music, and mindfulness. To his right, we have Dr. Frederick Barrett, a cognitive neuroscientist with training in behavioral pharmacology. He is Associate Director of Johns Hopkins Center of Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, and uses music and pharmacological interventions along with behavioral measures and brain imaging techniques. To his right, we have Daniel Carcillo, former NHL player, two-time Stanley Cup winner, and now founder and CEO of Wesana Health, a biotech company focused on developing novel psychedelic therapies and advancing treatment paradigms. Daniel is a well-known advocate and a frequent speaker on issues like traumatic brain injury and mental health issues associated with that. So to his right, we have Dr. Robert Koffman, a retired Navy Medical Corps captain, now caring for active duty and veteran populations as a volunteer. He is, as his resume speaks for itself, he's served as the Navy's first head of combat and operational stress control, which included advising the Navy surgeon as Navy Medicine's inaugural director of psychological health. Dr. Koffman finished his 32-year career as a psychiatrist and preventative medicine physician as the chief of clinical operations at the National Intrepid Center of Excellence at Walter Reed. I think it's important to, before we really get into the weeds, to start with a story. We have a video of a veteran. His name is Jeff, with his wife Jill, and his journey through PTSD and how psychedelics helped him. And I say this from a really personal place. I would not be in this room today if it wasn't for psychedelic medicine. And I don't mean that I wouldn't be CEO of Psychedelic Medicine Coalition. I literally would not be alive here. I was dealing with severe postpartum depression after the birth of my second child. When nothing else was working and my life was spiraling out of control, my marriage was falling apart, and I was a very absent mother. Psychedelic medicine saved me, and I am present today because of it. So we can talk about research and statistics and data, but we all need to remember that these are really human stories, and giving somebody the opportunity to live a full life up to their potential is extremely impactful, not just for them, but for their families and their communities. So let's start with a video of Jeff and Jill.
My name's Jeff, retired SEAL. My dad passed going into high school. I was 14 years old. I always get this sort of reaction, from folks when they're like, you're a Navy SEAL, and they find out my dad was in the Peace Corps, and they view it as two very different things, and I never did. Someone has to be able to stabilize an area so that people like my dad, big people, could come in and do their work.
I met him right before his first deployment. I've never met anybody that intense. I would ask him a question, and intensely look at me to answer it. He was really smart, really funny, loves people and feels things very strongly, and I was attracted to that.
I remember at some point, I was like 15 years in the service, and I had never spent more than 3 months consecutively at my home. I was constantly needed to overwhelm myself with activity, movement, for fear of stopping. Because what happens when you stop? And I think that's the cost. What if you're good at something that isn't good, but necessary in some cases? But that becomes the burden that you have to carry. No one else can carry that. I remember coming back from a deployment, and my oldest son was at church and was singing. And so I was sitting there looking around, and all these parents are smiling, and they've got their video cameras out and their phones, and they're all having a great time. And I'm sitting there, and I was nothing. No emotional connection to what I was doing there, with my son. And my wife made this comment that I wasn't the same person. I remember saying, yeah, this is me now. Like, that doesn't exist anymore.
It seemed like there were more and more arguments that just kind of got out of control to where it would almost wouldn't make sense why he was so upset.
So she reached out to the unit that I was at the time and basically asked for help.
And we found out this isn't the first person.
The majority of my peers were all dealing with the same thing.
I mean, you hear PTSD, but nobody talking about it.
So from 2014 to 2018, I had been on antidepressants, but then also stimulants and stuff to help me sleep. And then I tried to get off of them, and it was painful. It left me with the understanding of how people get to the point where they're done. Probably about 2 years after I retired, and I was still on medication, not able to get off of it, I came across a friend who I hadn't seen in a while, and I looked very different than what they used to seeing me. And they texted me later, I was like, dude, I didn't even recognize you. Like, are you okay? Like, what's going on? And I was like, struggling, but whatever, man, it's nothing new. And he's like, hey, I went through this treatment and changed my life. All right, man, you say it works, I'll go do it.
That was so far out there that it was like when you told me that, I was like, what are you talking about? But I think at that point, it was like, he's tried a lot of other things.
So we went down to Mexico, took the medicine, and like nothing's happening. I'm laying down physically in this world, but in this experience, I'm standing up, hovering over 2 giant cylinders that represented the negative and the positive. And suddenly the bottom of those 2 cylinders just opened up. And everything flushed out. And it was incredibly relieving. All that stuff, years, just gone. And I felt my consciousness like kind of fall through myself and like through death, but then somehow everything was in a different direction, and it was like being blasted towards love and just this like graciousness, and what the only way I can describe is what I would imagine God to be like. I remember coming out of it and feeling all the pain and sadness in the world, and it was overwhelming. It was like I started weeping and realized that all the things I was so stressed out about, so concerned about, like just are not real, they're not important. And it was incredibly, incredibly liberating. I was able to forgive myself and then have a different perspective of those experiences.
I think he's more accepting of himself, and he's a lot easier on himself, and that I think helps his relationships, with me and with the kids. It's not like he's a different person, unrecognizable, or anything like that. It's kind of the Jeff that he was when we met when we were younger.
I was able to make long-term changes, not only just in behavior and habit, but also how I think. That's how you sustain change. Previous approaches of just looking for, a pill or a shot, you're putting the responsibility of healing on those things, as opposed to what plant medicine did was open the door for me to put the responsibility of healing on me, and then make it last.
It's been a hard journey, but I always felt blessed to be on it with Jeff. As hard as it was, I always felt very grateful to be on it with him. And when I think about the future, I know that I'll continue the journey with him, and I'm good with that.
Okay. Dr. Koffman, describe your work in the current state of psychedelic research at the VA.
Good morning, everyone. It feels like that. Thank you all for being here, by the way. I know, as Melissa was saying, how ridiculously busy your lives are. But you could not have come for a more important topic. Jeff, who I know well, suffered tremendously. And all of us are on this panel right now because we understand, first and foremost, the extent of Jeff's suffering. Bottom line up front, by all measures and instruments and assessments, what we're doing is not working. Our rates of PTSD and suicide and anxiety and substance use and overdose are through the roof. 1 in 6 Americans are on psychiatric drugs. And we're providers up here. The mental health burden in this country, particularly with the diseases of despair, and we'll talk about veteran need here in a little bit, but these diseases of despair are killing our citizens. And in the words of our former director of National Institute of Mental Health, Tom Enzel, what we've been doing for the last 5 decades ain't working. And that's why we're up here today, to try and introduce or show or destigmatize plant medicine or psychedelic medicine, or however you want to refer to it as. This was Jeff. Jeff had 1 weekend treatment, and he's off all of his psychotropics. And I know because I'm a close friend of Jeff. Jeff belongs to the Veteran Mental Health Leadership Coalition, as I do, to try and have people become aware of the fact that the government, the federal government, is falling short in funding this necessary research. You're going to hear from panelists today about what kind of dollars are being directed to psychedelic research. Fortunately, the Bronx VA is the first, and now, and hopefully won't be the only facility doing psychedelic medicine research with MDMA for PTSD. In fact, I spoke with Dr. Rachel Yehuda the other day. She's the PI, and this open label phase 2 study is already showing veterans that the VA is not your, quote, father's VA, that our old and tired remedies, which are not remedies, can be improved upon. Let me just close by saying, giving you a little perspective in terms of what we're up against. NYU did a recent study. Maria Steenkamp was the PI, looking at 35 years, the last 35 years of evidence-based treatment of veterans for PTSD. And her group actually reviewed 36 different RCTs, the gold standard for research. And 70% of those veterans felt better, 2/3 of them retained their diagnosis of PTSD. Now you're going to hear today that with the MDMA trial, that number has just been turned on its head. 2/3 of individuals who go through the MDMA assisted therapy trial, and with an emphasis on assisted therapy, 2/3 of them no longer meet diagnostic criteria for PTSD. This is why Bronx VA is doing an MDMA study looking at 2 doses as opposed to 3 doses, which is what the initial MAP study was. This is why the Loma Linda VA and the Portland VA are going to be following suit with different types of protocols and different studies, whether it's group administration or, in the case of Portland, or whether it's couples work, in the case of Loma Linda. I look forward to a robust discussion and realize that Jeff's not alone. 1 in 5, 1 in 6 veterans have returned from war, like Jeff. And I'll pass the mic.
One more question for you, Bob. What needs to change to expand this?
Sorry?
What needs to change to expand this?
Funding.
It's that simple. I'm going to turn it to Dr. Barrett and Dr. Allsop. Dr. Barrett, let's start with you. What is the current state of psychedelic research at Johns Hopkins?
So our lab and research center at Johns Hopkins was formally established in 2019 based on the work that began with my mentor Roland Griffiths in 1999 or 2000. Since then, we've conducted basically what some consider to be groundbreaking studies, both in healthy individuals and in a variety of patient populations. The first few studies that we conducted demonstrated that with properly screened individuals, under carefully controlled circumstances, we could safely administer high doses of the psychedelic drug psilocybin, which is the active component in hundreds of species of mushrooms, to healthy individuals. And these individuals, despite being otherwise medically and psychiatrically healthy, endorsed having personal and well-being benefits, emotional and well-being benefits for at least a year after the experience. Some identifying the experience as among the top 5 or single most meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives. And this is not self-report of the participants themselves, but also community observers, spouses, family members, community members, co-workers who said, yeah, this individual, they're happier, they're less stressed, they're operating more efficiently, they're just a better person in some ways. And since then, we've had the privilege of being able to investigate whether psychedelic drugs could be helpful in treating patients with a life-threatening cancer diagnosis, people who have been lifetime smokers and are trying to quit, and individuals who are suffering from major depressive episodes of major depressive disorder. In our most recent study, we demonstrated that over 50% of individuals treated with psilocybin, which in the treatment involves up to 8 hours of psychotherapy followed by a whole day carefully controlled drug administration session, one or two of those, then followed by weeks of additional psychotherapy. These individuals, over 50% of them were in remission from depression for at least a year afterwards. More than 70% of the individuals in the study had a clinically significant response to psilocybin therapy, which was a 50% or greater reduction in their symptom severity. This really kind of blows out of the water some of our more traditional approaches to psychiatric therapy, especially for mood disorders. And similarly, if not more impressive, results have been demonstrated for tobacco use disorder, alcohol use disorder. There's a recent study published by NYU that demonstrated impressive reductions in drinking after psilocybin therapy for alcohol use disorder. But essentially, we're still at the very early stages of these studies. The studies themselves have been almost entirely funded by private philanthropy and private donors. Some organizations that have come forward, some with incredibly generous gifts and grants. The most recent being from the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, as well as Tim Ferriss and a number of other philanthropists who donated $17 million to Johns Hopkins to found the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. But that only brings us so far. We also recently received a grant from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, Dr. Matt Johnson, my colleague, to conduct a multi-site trial in patients with tobacco use disorder. But this is really just scratching the surface. If we think of the amount of funding and the amount of studies and the amount of participants that need to be studied for the FDA to approve a new drug as a medicine for an indication, they're typically looking at thousands or many thousands or tens of thousands of people being treated. Overall, with classic psychedelics being psilocybin or LSD or something like that, we have in the low hundreds of people who have been treated. So we have really incredible signals for the potential of these compounds to be very effective and rather safe under the right conditions. We just have, I don't want to say light years to go. We have a very long way to go. MDMA therapy for PTSD is the furthest ahead of all of these, and MAPS, as the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, has taken MDMA therapy across, I don't want to say the finish line yet, but as far as they can, and they handed the FDA the data from a phase 3 registration trial for MDMA, and it's now in the FDA's hands to determine whether they can use that to approve MDMA. I think everybody thinks that's going to happen. It hasn't happened yet, but it's really important to note that MDMA has only been studied in the case of PTSD. Psilocybin has really only been studied in the case of mood disorders and a number of substance use disorders. And these are different compounds. They have slightly different to very different therapeutic approaches. And they have varying levels of evidence. MDMA for PTSD so far having the most evidence, but psilocybin for depression and substance use having growing and incredibly compelling evidence. One policy won't fit all. One policy change may not be necessary for really correcting our understanding of these compounds. But a lot more work needs to be done, and now that we have something that is showing such a potential efficacious signal, as Dr. Insel had said, what we've done for the past 5 decades hasn't worked. This is something that may work, and it may work in a very different way. We have to understand it better.
So you alluded to the data set that actually exists for these medicines being relatively small. There's a lot of hype that happens with psychedelic medicine. A lot of it is justified because we are seeing results that traditional medications haven't received. What are some of the barriers to expand this research?
Quote the Koffman funding. Funding is part of the answer. These compounds are incredibly difficult to work with for additional reasons, including but not limited to the restrictions put on these compounds as Schedule I substances. At Hopkins, we have the benefit of having an incredibly extensive and experienced pharmacy in the hospital with an investigational drug service that is perfectly equipped to receive, handle, store, and dispense these scheduled compounds with chain of custody and all sorts of other things that satisfy the regulations. There are plenty of really well-positioned and well-experienced investigators in the country who would really be doing incredible things with these compounds in terms of experimental trials. But the barriers to entry for those individuals are far greater if they don't have exactly the resources they have at Hopkins. And essentially the barriers that are put up by having these compounds being scheduled are immense and substantial. And the question right now is whether or not Schedule 1 is appropriate for these compounds. I am not a policy person. I will not speak on policy. I'm a scientist. I can say that it does seem as though these drugs may have medical benefit. They, as a class of compounds, don't express liability for abuse in the same way that other compounds do. And under controlled circumstances, they seem to be at this point rather safe.
So, that being said, the federal government has already played a role in psychedelic research. The clinical trials are housed at the FDA. DEA controls a lot of the process of the research. Because they are Schedule 1, how do those two agencies interact with each other? Are they acting in tandem? Are they super coordinated? Or has it been a battle between the two because of cultural differences?
It's an excellent question. It's a bit of a puzzle to me, frankly. The process, as I understand it, is that once we receive ethics review committee approval at our institution through an institutional review board, and then we receive, a may proceed letter for an investigation of a new drug application to the FDA. Those processes seem fairly straightforward. We then submit that information to the DEA in order to either obtain a Schedule 1 license or add a protocol or a drug compound to our Schedule 1 license if it exists. If you have a Schedule 1 license, and this is the process that I have to go through. Once I submit all that information to the DEA, they then send the IND that was just reviewed and approved back to the FDA to re-review and re-approve. And then it comes back to the federal office, then the federal office puts their stamp on it, moves that to the local field office. The local field office then, in whatever time frame they can, goes through whatever process they need to investigate whether or not these compounds will go through the proper chain of custody and meet all the regulations that they need for the storage and dispensing of these compounds. Frankly, the DEA process is the most enigmatic to me. It seems to take the most time, and it also puts up, to my mind, the greatest number of barriers to entry and to use, even for experienced groups such as ours.
So this process can take months, if not years?
The average is about 9 months,
9 months.
from initial submission to then permission to obtain the compound for use in research.
Assuming you have expertise in getting these through.
Yes, and I want to be clear. I absolutely believe that you need to have the expertise to properly conduct these trials before you engage in them. So, to some degree, the FDA review process is thorough, and I think that there are many people at the FDA who are trying to make sure that this is all being done safely, and that makes sense. It's just that once you have that expertise, once you have everything in place, it seems like there are additional barriers in there.
So this question is for you, Dr. Barrett, or you, Dr. Allsop. Feel free to chime in. What opportunities exist for psychedelic research? And how does this field of research differ from other kinds of mental health or any kind of scientific research?
I'll start. Again, thank you for being here and the opportunity to speak to you all. I think it's very clear from the comments that have been made so far that I feel like we're all in agreement that the current mental health solutions are not adequate, they're not working. As a psychiatrist, I see it all the time in the emergency room. So I'm treating veterans at the VA who, very similar to the story that you told Dr. Koffman, on many different medications that are just not adequate in treating symptoms. I think psychedelic medicine clearly has opportunity across a number of different mental health fields. And this is not new, right? We knew this back in the 50s and 60s that there was incredible potential. And I think one of the things that we need to do now is be very thoughtful and creative in the ways that we seek about sort of bringing these into the clinical context and maybe even outside. I think as a social neuroscientist, I think about the capacity of these medicines to actually help us facilitate the transformation of our society. that is needed. Like, we're not just in a mental health crisis, we're in a human crisis. Our species may not survive if we don't actually make changes, not just to our medical field, but to how we actually approach life. And psychedelics have the capacity to potentially facilitate that. And so that is one way I see this as being a little bit different than some of the other sorts of research that we've engaged in mental health, where it's not really about just treating a symptom, which is what most of our current strategies do, but this is talking about something that can actually be not just transformative for one subjective experience of their life, but how we might form new and bolder, innovative ways of approaching our society that can cut across some of the things that currently separate us, like race and gender and sexual identity.
So, going back to you, Dr. Barrett, there's potential, and I know Johns Hopkins is spearheading some of this research, that this goes way beyond mental health. What are the other areas that psychedelics can help treat?
So as I said, the current research supports the potential efficacy of psychedelic drugs for the treatment of mood disorders, substance use disorders, PTSD is possible. Other people are beginning to study the effects of psilocybin in treating chronic headaches, such as cluster headaches, opioid use disorder. We have a variety of studies involving anorexia, Alzheimer's, dementia, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. We're also beginning to study the effects of psilocybin in treating PTSD. Others are doing the same. Some people are investigating the effects of psilocybin in treating complex trauma, phantom limb pain, chronic pain, and so these extend certainly beyond psychiatric disorders. There's also the question of whether psychedelic therapy in the correct context could be helpful for the betterment of well people, and this is really a difficult and touchy subject because of the characterization of psychedelics as drugs of abuse, and the restrictions put on psychedelic study by the Controlled Substances Act, and frankly, what I began with was just the recognition that the first few studies that were conducted at Hopkins were conducted in healthy people who indicated positive signal for benefit. Now, this is not to go and say that everybody should be using psychedelics in uncontrolled circumstances. We conducted a number of surveys across 2014 and 2016 that were published and demonstrated that people who are engaging in psychedelic use in uncontrolled circumstances can really come to kind of great signals for risk, and those need to be acknowledged, and we need to understand, and I don't think anybody would argue that these are not powerful, psychologically powerful compounds. People can be in incredibly vulnerable states with these compounds, as was evidenced by some controversy around one of the sites for the MAPS PTSD trial of someone who suffered from sexual abuse during the trial. There will always be abuses, and we always have to be careful to protect people in vulnerable states. But that does not mean that we should only consider these compounds for the treatment of a diagnosable illness. And we have to kind of respect the fact that while we may or may not have encountered some kind of psychiatric diagnosis, either personally with our family, friends, or someone else that we know, we're all here to flourish as human beings. And we deserve that right to flourish as human beings. And I think that we should consider the possibility that certain things that are used as treatment can also be used under incredibly controlled circumstances to promote flourishing.
Thank you. Dr. Allsop, there's been some chatter within psychedelic circles about how we have an opportunity now to do research in a different way. A lot of traditional research is the subjects are pretty homogenous in race and identity. How can psychedelic research be different and much more inclusive?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because it's actually a huge issue. There's been a lot of incredible work done, as Carcillo talked about. When you look at these studies, however, you will see that the population is very homogeneous. Michael Williams has done a lot of great work looking at sort of the major trials, and you see no more than 2.5% people of African descent in these studies. Like 1 point something percent people of Latin backgrounds, around 2% for people of Asian backgrounds. And so there's clearly a gap that we're not filling. I think this has been not unique to psychedelics. It's sort of just another manifestation of a chronic issue within our society, which also shows up within our medical system and our research system. I think because we're at such a formative phase, again, it gives us an opportunity to be thoughtful and creative. How do we not just recapitulate all of the same old paradigms, which, as everyone has said, like, haven't been working well for all of society? How do we actually create structures that benefit all of our citizens and give us all an opportunity to thrive? And I think this specific field of research is well positioned to potentially do that. I think one of the ways we do that is by really, from the very beginning, engaging in the community. There's been a medical model in which we're the experts, we design everything, we tell you what you need, and then we come in and say, hey, come do our thing. And then sometimes you wonder, well, why doesn't that work for everybody? And so I think we need to start thinking about how do we actually engage the community from the beginning, find out what do people actually need, what are the ways in which we can allow them to be stakeholders and actually shape how their treatment unfolds. And so I think taking those kinds of approaches are ways in which we can begin to think about how we create structures that not only treat symptoms across sort of the mental health diagnoses, but also begin to get at this idea of how do we use psychedelic medicines to really facilitate societal transformation.
Thank you. So psychedelic medicine is not necessarily a new concept. Indigenous groups from around every continent essentially have used psychedelic medicine as part of their cultural practice. It is an important issue for PMC to uphold to allow indigenous groups to uphold those traditional practices. How do we elevate indigenous and minoritized communities as key research stakeholders? You touched on this a little bit, but maybe just speak a little bit more about how we can engage indigenous practitioners with all of their cultural knowledge in this scientific field.
Yeah, again, I think it takes for us to have some degree of cultural humility. I think, again, often as academics, we come in with a very specific sort of framework that, to be honest, is a very sort of Eurocentric Western framework, and we often engage with communities in an extractive way, where it's like, hey, we're going to come in, you tell us our secrets, tell us your secrets, we're going to use them. I think coming up with a much more egalitarian way of engaging communities, having people that are indigenous on these sorts of panels so that they can actually speak about what they're struggling with, thinking about conservation and how we actually go about doing what we're doing in ways that are sustainable. These cultures for millennia have been sustainable and have really curated the wisdom that comes from these ways of being and knowing and healing. And so how do we, from the very beginning, give them an active voice at the table? And so I think that is part of how we start to shift our frameworks and allow for that creativity. Again, embedding it in the community and giving people in the community, people who have actually been a part of bringing these to the broader world, an opportunity to be stakeholders, not just in the intellectual conception, but also in sort of the financial gain that is sure to come, is already coming in.
It's a good time to transition to Daniel Carcillo. Thank you, Dr. Barrett. You're awesome. Daniel, I'd like you to speak a bit about the state of psychedelic drug development, but before that, you've are a former NHL player, very accomplished, 2-time Stanley Cup winner, but for you that came with a price, right?
It did. First of all, thanks for everybody being here. Melissa, last time we were together was for Initiative 81, so good to see you. Yeah, so I played 12 years in the NHL. I fought 164 times, and I was forced into early retirement at the age of 30 because of 7 diagnosed traumatic brain injuries. When I retired, I've since been on this 8.5-year journey to recover my health and wellness and my quality of life, and that has led me to psychedelic therapies. When I retired in 2015, I was dealing with mild dementia, so things like slurred speech, headache, head pressure, insomnia, impulse control issues, light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, appetite loss, short-term, long-term memory loss, on top of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. A good day was 5 of those symptoms being available to me every morning. A bad day was 10 plus. And I came from a different arena than a veteran. I had all of the means in the world to go out and pay for treatment myself, which I did for the first 5 years. I went to functional neurologists. I went to the best CT brain banks. I went to different stroke rehabilitation concussion clinics, all which are mostly cash because insurance doesn't cover anything right now because there's no FDA-approved pharmaceutical for TBI, traumatic brain injury, or the specific things that come along with that, like depression, anxiety. So I was on a number of different pharmaceuticals. When I decided to stop that 2 years in, I had seizures coming off of them. I continued on my journey looking at other holistic measures like float tanks, hyperbaric chamber, changing my diet, things like MOX acupuncture, which help flush out inflammation. And I got to a place 3.5 years ago. I have 3 young kids, 7, 5, and 4, and obviously a wife that's stood by me and loves me very much. And I got to a place where I thought that I was a burden to everybody around me, where people were a little off-put by my presence, and I knew that I was sick and I knew that I was off. And so I started to make some pretty poignant plans to take my own life, to unburden my family. The #1 cause of death after traumatic brain injury is suicide. And I believe that's because there's just not a lot of education and awareness of symptoms and then how to manage them. And so luckily, a former teammate reached out. I took an invitation to a decriminalized city, and I partook in a psilocybin ceremony. This PhD biochemist who grew the medicine, invited me there, and I said, great, I'll bring the beer and I'll bring the cigarettes, and we're gonna have a party. And that's not what this was about. He basically, when I got there, explained to me that we were gonna manage, the set, your intention, the setting in which we're going to dose, and then the actual dosage amount. And so he ended up dosing me with 5.6 grams of magic mushrooms, the active ingredient being psilocybin, which is what a lot of the doctors on this panel are researching at their institutions. And I had a very difficult first 2 hours, which was managed by, I guess you could call him a clinician, or a person that is just very familiar with this medicine, and he helped guide me through this experience. And one of the amazing things about psilocybin, which isn't MDMA, which isn't DMT, is that it exacerbates what's at the forefront of your mind. So before this ceremony, he prepared me. Obviously, he knew I was suicidal, that I was going to see what was causing my suffering. And then I was going to be able to work through it, which is what happened in the first 2 hours, and then the next 2 hours was very beautiful. And I came out of that ceremony understanding that I was the creator of my own heaven or hell. I've had a lot of my teammates who've passed on, and I've been very critical of the NHL, bringing forward a lawsuit there, bringing forward a class action lawsuit in Canada, to basically get them to do what the NFL has done, which is tell the truth about the risk of traumatic brain injury. And so it really transformed my life. The best way I can describe it is I woke up the next morning feeling the way I should. As I was on that farm for 2 weeks, symptoms started to fall away. Light sensitivity wasn't there, slurred speech wasn't there. With my depression, I was isolating a lot. All I wanted to do was get back home to my family. And I also knew that I've been hitting people since the age of 4, so nothing's gonna get fixed in 5 hours. So with this PhD biochemist, we made formulations that included CBD, other functional mushrooms, and then a low-dose therapy of a non-hallucinogenic subperceptual dose of psilocybin. I stayed on that dose for 6 months. Before I went to the retreat, I tested my brain with a QEEG, and I tested my blood. After 6 months, everybody around me saw the difference, I saw the difference. I retested my brain, it came back with no abnormalities. And then I looked at my blood work, there were again no abnormalities. So I was pretty amazed, and that's when I started to reach out to the community, started to offer my story, my platform to decriminalize nature and some of these movements. And then I met Rick Doblin of MAPS, who said how impactful this could be for, obviously women of domestic violence, war veterans, not just obviously athletes, and then the 6 million people that actually go to the emergency room and get a TBI diagnosis, which is extremely underreported in America. So then I founded Wesana Health. I used my own personal money to patent the methods, because in this country, you need to have intellectual property to be able to raise money to go through the FDA to develop a drug, which is very difficult for a number of different reasons and a long process. And we've communicated with the FDA. Should I go into that? Yeah. We've communicated with the FDA back in March 11th. I founded the company a year and a half ago. Some of the people in this room have actually supported that mission. And I brought on a team of drug developers. Obviously, that is not what I am, but I'm able to lead the mission, create awareness, and manage. And so the FDA said a number of different things. So to be able to submit an application to the FDA for a pre-IND meeting, a pre-investigational new drug application, there's a lot of hurdles and steps that you have to go through, as Dr. Barrett mentioned, mainly with the DEA, and then so for example, we had to go to Charles River in Finland because it took almost upwards of 8 months to get psilocybin into the hands of researchers so they could put it into animals, so that you can present the data to the FDA in a poignant way, so that they can give you feedback and hopefully an approval to move forward into an actual IND. So we did that in a very poignant way. We also submitted a 320-page briefing booklet describing all of the safety data that exists currently on psilocybin. And I should mention that psilocybin has been designated FDA Breakthrough Therapy designation by 2 different companies already, so Wesana and Compass Pathway. So, but it still remains a Schedule 1, as Mr. Barrett mentioned, with no medicinal value and the view that it's still highly addictive. So we submitted this meeting request. They came back to us within 6 weeks, which we were pleasantly surprised. And we had the meeting. It was a written response. It was during COVID. And they said some very interesting things. We went in with traumatic brain injury related depression. The FDA doesn't validate any endpoints that you can actually research traumatic brain injury, so you have to research a symptom that has well-validated endpoints, which is depression. So they ended up broadening our indication. They said, if you think this works for traumatic brain injury related, then it should work for everybody that has depression. And so they broadened our indication from 6 million people to over 200 million people worldwide, which was surprising. And then they fast-tracked us. So usually after a pre-IND meeting, you go into an IND approval, and then you go into a phase 1, which is where you put this drug into healthy, normal human beings. They told us to bypass that and to go through to a phase 1B and a 2A, where we could actually put this drug into human beings. Now, that was completely unheard of. At the time, we have well over 80 years of drug development experience on the team, and we're proposing putting 2 Schedule I drugs together for a self-administered at-home dose that lives on your counter. So the fact that they fast-tracked us was pretty amazing. And then they did something that was also surprising. They offered up 3 orphan indications for us to research because they knew that we had a pre-IND number on migraines. We were going to go after migraine right after depression because my wife, who suffered from migraines, has found a lot of success with this microdose regimen. And so them offering up 3 orphan indications for us to study was really amazing as well. So I think the FDA is somewhat on board to help move this research along, and that's exciting. I can touch on the other companies that are researching in this space. So MindMed has a phase 2 using LSD for anxiety. Wesana Institute is in a phase 2 using a high dose of psilocybin, which will need to be done in a clinic with supervision for major depressive disorder. Compass Pathways, phase 2, high dose psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Small Pharma, phase 2, using DMT, also done in a clinic for major depressive disorder. MAPS, the furthest along, phase 3, MDMA, PTSD. Like the good doctors have said, over 67% efficacy. So we're talking about a cure here. We're not talking about managing symptoms for the rest of our lives. Awaken did a safety and tolerability study for MDMA, and then obviously Wesana with a low dose therapy moving into a 1B, 2A in the next 5 months. So that's the kind of current state. Do you want me to touch on the funding?
Yeah.
So we commissioned FreeMind, who is out of Israel. They have about a 60% success rate when applying for grants to the NIH and the DoD. So there's obviously, you've heard that there's a need for, a big need for a change in funding, which, as I understand it, would come from, I grew up in Canada, so this is a little bit new to me, but I'm learning, would come from this room and putting it in the right people to write the right laws to push along for this change and a need for change. So the current state of funding, the NIDA has funded $8 million into psychedelic research. The NIMH has funded only $2.2 million. The NIGMS has funded $1 million. The NCCIH has funded $800,000. The NCI has funded $800,000. The NIBIB has funded $200,000. The NINDS has funded $200,000, and the VA has funded $0.
That's for you to drop the mic.
So there needs to be a change through the NIH process. There's 2 ways to go about it. There's unsolicited grants, so you can actually write into the NIH to propose a study that you want to do and hope for approval and go through the process. 60 to 70% of those proposed grants come from academia. And then there's also solicited grants. So the NIH comes up with a study that organizations can apply for if you meet the right criteria. To date, there are no calls for funding that are specific or focused on psychedelics from the NIH, which needs to change. And we need to tap into existing funding opportunities, meaning that can be done in 2 ways. So we can add an area of interest focused on psychedelics, for example, for the area of traumatic brain injury. Last year, the NIH opened up grants upwards, I believe, of $120 million, but I couldn't apply because we use psychedelic medicine for traumatic brain injury. And then another way is issue a notice of special interest. So I hope that gives everybody the current state on both drug development and funding.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, there's propensity to fund this type of research at NIH, and NIH is the biggest funder, I believe, in the world of scientific research in general. And there's just such a strong argument here that a dedicated bucket of funding for psychedelic research is necessary to build up this body of data that policymakers can use to move forward with psychedelic reform. What's happening now at a state and local level is localities, cities are decriminalizing psychedelics. I think that there is an interest in the general public in psychedelic medicine, and now people are, well, decriminalizing is really important. No one should go to jail for this. People are turning to the underground to get healing, and this can turn into a situation that, you know, people are going into unsafe situations, and we just need to make sure that psychedelic reform doesn't fall into the same pitfalls that cannabis reform has gone into, with so much progress being made on the state level, state and city level, without the federal government moving in lockstep. So, you know, while I think we've highlighted today the importance of funding for research, this is one step in the process for just overall reform with psychedelic medicine. You know, there's now states that are passing state research-funded bills, and this is happening not only in blue states, it's happening in red states like Oklahoma, Missouri. This is happening all over the place, because I think that both sides of the aisle now are acknowledging that these issues that psychedelic medicine is addressing are human issues, that there's no political party. There's no need to politicize mental health and well-being. And it's just really critical that we start to give our agencies the resources they need to really look at this as a new frontier for healthcare in general. I know we've gone over time a little bit, and I apologize for that, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. We have a microphone up here if anyone has anything they'd like to ask of the panelists.
Dr. Barrett, what would you say your success rate has been so far with your patients that you've tested on?
Indeed, thanks. So the Psychedelic Center has a number of faculty conducting independent investigations. In our most recent study in patients with major depressive disorder, we studied and published on 24 patients, over half of whom were in remission from depression at least a year after 2 doses of psilocybin. And more than 70% of people in that study had a clinically significant reduction in depression severity that also lasted about, well, at least a year. In another study conducted in our center, we saw rapid and sustained remission from depression and anxiety in the vast majority of participants who were suffering from a late-stage cancer diagnosis. So you may know that the existential crisis that accompanies a late-stage cancer diagnosis is often the most difficult thing to treat outside of the actual cancer patients who are suffering in that way. So that's a remarkable finding, and we had parallel finding reported by colleagues at NYU in 2016 when we published our study. My colleague Matt Johnson has showed over 80% biologically verified abstinence for over a year and a half in people who were suffering from tobacco use disorder after 2 or 3 doses of psilocybin. Again, a remarkable effect. And smoking is a killer in this country. We're not, paying as much attention to, but we really should be paying as much attention to. And others within the United States and around the world have found similar effects.
And are they coupling that treatment with traditional therapies and things, or is it just that treatment?
It depends. It's mixed. So the typical model for psychedelic-assisted therapy to treat substance use disorders is often paired with a 12 or 16-week course of traditional psychotherapy. These are psychotherapies that are the best that we have, that alone aren't working that well, but then that seem to be working quite well in the context of psychedelic-assisted therapy. And it's a similar story with mood disorders. And we have many patients in our depression trial who had been on various forms of pharmacotherapy for depression, SSRIs or something similar for years. They've been in and out of therapy, and it's very difficult sometimes to find a therapist that works well with you. And a number of folks in our trial went back to therapy after psilocybin, and it worked You know, it's so this, it may not be completely a one-stop silver bullet type of thing, but the end point is the remarkable outcome here. You know, to those who still feel the need to return to therapy, you know, it seems that they have better access to it. You know, in the small number of patients that we've treated so far.
Any other questions?
I guess this is an open question to the panel, but do any of you deal with ketamine? Because I know it's been used a lot to treat depression, and there's even ketamine clinics opening up around the DC area, so.
So I'll just comment. I ran 3 ketamine clinics, so they were psychiatrist focused. We were using S-ketamine, which is a formulated version of ketamine. It's a J&J version, so that went through the FDA, and we could get insurance reimbursement for patients that were using that. It's an intranasal spray. The REMS come with, meaning it's the first, I mean, I wouldn't call it a classic psychedelic, but it has these effects on the brain. It does work really well for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. You have to stay in the clinic for 2 hours. So somebody can come into your clinic. Normally what we did was prepare them with the psychotherapy, and they can come in and dose the regimens twice a week and stay in the clinic, and then if they need to have further psychotherapy based upon the experience that they have and integrating what was seen or learned during that experience, then we provided that with further psychotherapy. We tracked outcome data, over 4,000 treatments since 2016, and what we saw was that we had, in PTSD, 47% of the patients with the PTSD diagnosis no longer qualified after 3 weeks of treatment. And the percentage for depression was just below 36%. And these are tracked by the traditional ways that Dr. Barrett or the doctors would track it with a Modger scale for depression in a classic FDA trial. So yeah, we saw really great results. Unfortunately, there's also, you know, other companies doing kind of at-home administrations without the psychotherapy. Those could work, but I think everything that you've heard here, you know, even with low-dose therapy of psilocybin, you still need to have support. You still need to talk to somebody and integrate, you know, what could be seen during some of these ceremonies into your everyday life to help you, be a better husband, father, family member, employee, etc.
If I could just follow up on that, I think, you know, not to kind of differentiate ketamine from psilocybin and MDMA and other things, which is kind of an important contrast to draw. Ketamine does come with risks that the other drugs don't necessarily. Ketamine has a much more well-characterized and clear abuse liability that accompanies it. You know, there is S-ketamine, which has been marketed and approved, but a lot of ketamine clinics that are popping up and have been around for a while are using, you know, racemic ketamine off-label. It's a mix of different forms of the ketamine molecule. My understanding is that, you know, oftentimes the use of ketamine for depression can be rapid, remarkable, and sustained for about a week. And for many people who seek treatment for ketamine, they have to come back in a repetitive fashion. Some people it may work, some people not. I haven't seen the data from Mr. Carcillo's clinics, but the difference is that it seems that, from my perspective, the ways that classic psychedelics like psilocybin can be effective, if they're effective, is 1 or 2 shot, very sustained longitudinal effects, without all the associated use liability, risks to the company, potential risks to the company.
If anyone else doesn't have any questions, we can wrap up. I really appreciate your time. I know you all are incredibly busy, like I said before. Please go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. You know, hopefully this will be one of many conversations we'll have about this with members of Congress and their staff, and we're really looking forward to building relationships with you all and moving this issue forward in a right practical way. So I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Never know. Well, it took me a while to get here.
Sure. I'm gonna turn this thing off. It's still recording.
Okay.
Good.
Good.
Yeah.